hour.
Yeah.
So I would like to welcome everybody for our last class of the semester. And I'm very happy to introduce Anna Milosevic, who is a postdoc researcher at the criminology department of the University of Leuven. And she's going to be presenting her research, which was also published just last year in a book published by Palgrave Macmillan, Europeanization and Memory Politics in the Western Balkans is the title of the book. And this is also some of her research on how memorialization in the Balkans fits into kind of European memory frameworks. And this is what she will be talking to us with today. And just as a reminder for everybody, just to keep their microphones and cameras off during the presentation. And afterwards, of course, you're welcome to ask any questions in the chat or by in person, which is always nice in person because we're always happy to see the audience as well. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Anna. So go ahead, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Florian. And thank you for inviting me today to speak in your class. So as Florian said, I'm going to present some of the results of my research on the effects of Europeanization on memory politics in the Western Balkans in particular. And this, let's say, edited volume that we published last year draws from my PhD research. And my PhD research actually has investigated the in-depth the effects of Europeanization on memory politics in Serbia and Croatia. But the edited volume actually addresses all the countries in the Western Balkans. So how I'm going to go with this presentation. So first of all, I'm going to give you an introduction. So then we are going to I'm going to talk more about the mechanisms of Europeanization. I'm going to explain what are the effects. We are going to look at a number of cases. And I really look forward to maybe some of the examples that you will bring into the discussion later on in the Q&A session. So how I like to start my talk on Europeanization of memory politics in the Western Balkans is, of course, by mentioning one of the most, I think, iconic cases that can explain how this process works and what actually is this process of Europeanization of memory. And the case in question is the one of North Macedonia, of course. So as you remember, last year, while we were busy with the pandemics and everything what was going on globally, but also in our personal lives, there was some time in September 2020 that Bulgaria actually blocked North Macedonia's progress in the EU negotiations. And Bulgaria used the EU member veto and demand from North Macedonia to formally recognize this historical Bulgarian roots of Macedonian language. So this demand was actually met with the remarks of the North Macedonian Prime Minister Zaev, who said that it is not European to write the history of other nations. So do nations actually have a historical DNA? And is there such a thing as a historical DNA of a nation? What is a case of North Macedonia and the problems North Macedonia had with Bulgaria and Greece actually shows is that there is this kind of interplay, there is this connection between Europeanization and memory politics. And memory politics, if we think about what is actually memory politics, we have to come to a conclusion that is extremely, extremely malleable, and that we can bend the meanings and interpretations and roles to the purposes, and also interpretations of many, many different actors that can be on local or national or even a European level. So how this process of politics of memory actually works, what kind of dimensions are to memory politics and Europeanization. So we have seen that on the one hand, we have this top-down level, and memory politics, as the North Macedonia case shows, can be led and also imposed by external actors, such as the European Union. And of course, there are no formal requirements for that in the EU accession process. So there is no way of European Union saying explicitly, you, a candidate country, have to deal with the past and this and that way. So there is no prescription, there is no a recipe, there is no formal requirement on behalf of the European Union. But nonetheless, there is this kind of expectation that the candidate countries and potential member states, they will adhere to what we call the EU memory framework. So we will go on in detail and I will explain what the EU memory framework actually is. But for the moment, just stay with me and remember that there is no formal requirement, but there is an expectation. So by doing this, by aligning with this expectation, by responding to these expectations by the European Union, what do the candidate countries get actually? So they have to get something in return if this is not a formal requirement. So by aligning, the candidate countries actually, they signal their commitment to the EU project. They signal their alignment with what are perceived as the European norms of remembrance. They indicate their European identity, and they confirm this kind of commitment to the future and peace and togetherness, let's say. So to adhere to this kind of joint future in Europe, what does it mean? It means it translates actually in accepting the EU norms of remembrance, the values of peace, reconciliation, and overcoming the past. So for instance, if we think how this translates into the region of the Western Balkans in particular, we can always think about another case, the case of Serbia, when in 2009, we had the European Parliament making a resolution on Srebrenica, and actually including a passage into the text of resolution where the European Parliament directly invites Serbia and the Serbian Parliament to adopt a similar kind of resolution in national, let's say, legislation, in national commemorative calendar to acknowledge that Srebrenica was a genocide. So from the side of the European Parliament, from the side of the European Union, this was a kind of a soft requirement, soft kind of pressure on Serbia to engage with this historical episode, but also to provide some sort of acknowledgement and recognition for the victims. So this is on the top-down level, when we see that Europeanization is led and imposed by the European Union. So what happens actually on the bottom-up level? So how do the countries actually respond? What they do? How do they react to these formal and informal requirements? So there are multiple ways in which they respond to this. And if you're interested in this topic, you can read all about it in the edited volume. But what is important to remember here is that memory politics here plays a dual role. So on the one hand, it has a role of a cognitive device. And on the other hand, it is a political instrument. It is a political instrument that provides the elites, institutions, individuals, associations, different kind of organizations. It provides them power to pursue certain political interests. So as a political instrument, the EU memory framework has been used in many, many, many different ways. It has been co-opted, it has been manipulated. And if we think about another example, let's bring Croatia into discussion. We have seen that, subsuming some particular Second World War events into the broader European memory framework has actually allowed the sort of EU washing of crimes and injustices that have been committed by Croats in the Second World War. So this kind of, like the broader European and also international we shall never forget not framework, especially of the Holocaust remembers, has also allowed for a sort of, solidifying of the narrative of two totalitarianism, the fascism and communism as equal evils, in Croatia in particular. So we have, on the one hand, we have this top-down process. On the other hand, we have this bottom-up process. And what does it actually mean in relation to the EU integration of the Western Balkan countries? It means that, power asymmetries are quite important. So this process of Europeanization of memory has actually brought the power asymmetries to the forefront. What this means? It means that countries that are yet not members of the European Union, they are not in a privileged position to dictate their own views and interpretations of the past. And they're also in the position of coercing not yet EU member states into making concessions, into negotiating their historical DNA, into making these kind of interventions in the national memory politics. So of course, you know, when I say this, Macedonian case again comes to mind with the Bulgarian and the Greek contestation of what actually history of Macedonia is. And if we think about the conflict resolution, how can we resolve this issue in the process of European integration? We think about reaching the Prespa Agreement. So I hope that most of you already know what Prespa Agreement is or was. So I will not go into detail on that, but I will just say that the Prespa Agreement put an end to this dispute with Greece. And it kind of like gave support to the Macedonian EU pact. But what is also important to remember about the Prespa Agreement as a let's say conflict resolution instrument is that it provides clear guidelines to be introduced in the national memory politics. And these corrective measures actually ranged from really, really extreme and never seen before kind of intervention into changing the name of the country. So state renaming. And on the other hand, we have seen, you know, corrective measures such as the removal of Greek, Macedonian references and symbols in national memory politics, but also in urban space. So there was the renaming of the highway, there was the renaming of the airport, et cetera, et cetera. So this agreement actually what it represents a diplomatically forged consensus on dispute resolution, but is also a paramount example of how memory can be redesigned and reshaped for the sake of attaining political objectives. So this was a kind of like a brief introduction, what I'm going to talk about today. So I want to first present an overview of what is actually European memory before I go into depth about what is Europeanization process in relation to the memory politics in the Western Balkan states. And I'm going to talk also about the EU memory framework with more detail. And as I said, with bringing also other cases from other countries from the Western Balkans. So I would, if I were like in the same room with you guys now, I would like to ask you, what do you think European memory actually is? Is there such a thing as European memory? And what I like to hear from students actually in this discussion is that there is no such a thing, such a European memory. European memory do not exist. There is European memory politics, which is something completely different. And there is also this kind of EU memory framework. So what is actually European memory framework? And I will show you a few slides in a second. EU memory framework actually is a set of policies, soft laws, such as, for instance, resolutions, that delineate these kind of shared, joint attitudes towards the past. And this EU memory framework that is the cornerstone of EU memory politics, it's actually not something that, you know, the European political elites woke up one day and said, yeah, we're going to design the EU memory framework and we're going to have like this kind of, you know, like politics towards the past. This EU memory framework actually has evolved gradually without a grand design. It was a fruit of, you know, natural fruit of anniversaries, of different kind of opportunities. They were there, 50 years of the end of the Second World War, different kind of 100 years since the beginning of the First War, et cetera, et cetera. So it evolved naturally. It didn't have this kind of a grand design. But it's also quite important to remember that the very, you know, foundational narrative of the European Union is seen and interpreted and narrated also by the European Union as a kind of like victory over the past. So this is important because it tells us a lot about the self-interpretation and self-narration of the European Union, because there was this move from war to peace. And, you know, the European Union, as it sees itself, as it interprets itself through the documents, resolutions, et cetera, through memory politics, is as a fruit of, you know, like, is a mission of peace, of cohesion, of stability, combined also with this kind of economic integration. And this is, of course, you know, the product of the memory work. So how we went to define, actually, in our book, the EU memory politics, we said that it's actually a product of various self-narrations over time in search for its own identity and legitimacy, which is important to remember. And forging such a transnational view of of history in the European Union is actually based on discontinuity with the past. And this allows for this kind of like shared universal also European set of principles and values that actually set the boundaries on what is the past and what the future could actually look like. But the problem with forging the EU memory framework and forging these shared stances about the past is that, first of all, we have a number of member states. So we have seen the European Union expanding over the years, and each member state brought his own, you know, its own historical DNA, its own historical, also, let's say, baggage to the table. So there was, of course, in the Western Europe, in the first years and first decades of the European Union, there was this kind of, you know, like more unified, let's say, view on what the past actually was. So in Western Europe, the cornerstone of this common framework represents the memory of the Holocaust. And of course, when we had the Baltics, when we had Central Eastern European countries joining the European Union, there was this memory of the communist and Stalinist crimes as well. So this kind of other totalitarianism addition was brought to the forefront actually with the EU enlargement. So broadly speaking, the core of European memory politics includes the rejection of totalitarianism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, and it also is based on the respect for human rights, freedoms, protection of minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So in line with this gradual development of the European memory, of course, there was a research into understanding what is actually going on policy-wise at the European level. So how did my colleagues went about it? Like how we went to explain, you know, the difference between European memory, Europeanized memory, et cetera, transnational interpretation of the past. So first of all, we had early works that kind of like question whether we can actually talk about Europeanization of memory. So do we have some kind of supranational European memory? Why we should need it? It was like, in the first years, I think it was more of a wishful thinking that actually proving that there can be or there is such a thing such as a European memory or even Europeanized memory. So what was really important in those early works is that they highlighted the tendency that there was some kind of Europeanization of norms of remembrance. And these Europeanized norms of remembrance in those early years, especially in the 1990s, were clearly instrumental to the EU legitimacy and EU identity building. So there was this agreement, and I will show a slide now. There was this agreement that we should try to kind of forge a common view on the past. And this is also in response to the EU integration process towards the Eastern Europe, as I said, when they brought their own memories and their own understanding of the past, in particular the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War, which is completely different in two parts of Europe. So what you see here actually, and there for those who do not speak Bulgarian, it's like in step with the times. It's actually an excerpt from the resolution on totalitarianisms made by the European Parliament in 2009, which explicitly say that Europe will be united only if we have this kind of common understanding and common approach towards all these terrible crimes that have happened in Europe. So what this resolution actually inadvertently, I must say, did was that it provided a rationale for many actors in Europe, from political parties to individuals, to actually equalize communism, regardless of the form that communism had, with Nazism and fascism and other dictatorial regimes that have been in place in Europe in the World War II and also afterwards. This was, let's say, this resolution was quite important for the formation of the EU memory framework, but it also signaled this kind of process of actual Europeanization of collective memory, especially within the European institutions. So Europeanization of collective memory, I usually define it like this: as a construction, diffusion, institutionalization of shared values, remembrance practices, policies, discourses, narratives, beliefs, and norms that are associated with the past. And they're first defined and consolidated in the EU policy process, and then they are incorporated in the logic of domestic discourses, practices, and public policies of member states and acceding countries. It's a long and boring definition, but it goes to say actually that what is going to be Europeanized and how it's going to be Europeanized actually starts on the top level, starts within the European Union and within the European institutions. So there are a number of actors that are actively engaged and involved in this process of Europeanization of memory on the EU level. Of course, I already mentioned the European Parliament as being one of the lead actors because it provides this kind of legal, let's say, basis for what the lens, how we should actually interpret the past. So what are actually these shared views on the past? What is like commonly agreed among the member states in the European Parliament? So this is quite important because it's the basis of the EU memory framework, and the European Parliament is the main actor in this process. If you're really interested into what European Parliament actually does and how they relate to different kind of historical episodes such as colonialism or slave trade or terrorism, there is an interesting, I hope, special issue on this topic that's going to be published in a few weeks by the Politica Européenne that I co-edited with another colleague. So we have the European Parliament, as I said, on the one hand, and of course we have the Council, we have the Commission, we have a different number of actors that then help disseminate these commonly agreed values and interpretations of the past. And how that is done, it's another story that I will not tell today, but I will just gonna mention a number of financing instruments that are available, such as, for instance, the Europe for Citizens program by the European Commission, and a number of other programs that directly tackle the EU remembrance. They directly tackle this dimension of European remembrance and the ways in which these EU memory frameworks can be assimilated by the member states and adopted and pursued also by by a number of actors. So going back to what is actually EU memory framework, before I speak about the mechanisms of Europeanization of memory, I will just say a few words that are actually on the slide. So one is that the precursor of this memory work by the European Parliament was actually the Council of Europe. So the Council of Europe, even before the European Parliament, had a number of resolutions that actually addressed the past. But the European Parliament has been actively engaging with the issue of history only in the light of the EU accession of Central and Eastern European countries. So this is actually how the EU memory framework looks like, because it's easier to actually see than to talk about it and try to explain it. And this is from a paper that I have written a couple of years ago, I think, with a colleague, and where we confronted, actually, as you see on the left-hand side, we confronted the EU enlargement evolution with adoption of a number of resolutions by the European Parliament. Practically what we wanted to see is whether there was a particular moment when the European Parliament started actually, like mass producing these resolutions on history, and why they did that, what motivated them into doing that. And secondly, we also wanted to see what kind of memories were integrated in the EU memory framework. So you will see here that sometime around 2000, we can see that there was, like this turn towards integration of memories from Central and Eastern European countries. And before that, we have only sporadically this kind of like joint stances towards the Holocaust. They were concerned with countering racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., etc. There is this kind of small episode in 1987 with Le Pen, the father. That was actually one of the first instances that the European Parliament publicly and collectively condemned the behavior of one of the members of the European Parliament who was actually negating the Holocaust. And it was quite interesting because this kind of behavior by the members of the European Parliament persisted over the years. And it is something important, I think, to mention, that even today we have members of the European Parliament who are negating the Holocaust or other horrible crimes that have been committed in Europe. But the European Parliament at that time did not have any other tools at disposition to condemn that kind of behavior except for making this kind of a small resolution. So talking about what are actually the effects of this EU memory framework, it is important to mention that the mechanisms of Europeanization of memory are twofold. So on the one hand, we have the downloading of the EU memory framework. So what actually the downloading is? We have prospective EU members that actually want to signal their Europeanness, and they want to do it like in two ways. So they want to signal that they belong to the European family of nations formally, so by responding to the EU requirements. And what they also do, they manipulate and selectively download the contents of this EU memory framework to signal that they also share the same values as the European Union does. So symbolic politics, in this sense, it plays, I think, in a really important role to underpin a really wide variety of political objectives for the EU, for the member states, but also for the candidate countries. So, for instance, as I said, the European Parliament had this kind of soft pressure on Serbia to acknowledge the wartime atrocities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was not legally binding. It was not part of the official requirement, but it did exert some kind of soft pressure on Serbia to deal with the past. So what is also important to remember is this kind of soft pressure. It's not only the words. It's also prescribing a desired response, because if you look at the text of this resolution, it's like clear in one of the paragraphs the effect that the resolution aims to achieve. And the effect in that resolution, what actually intended effect, was to actually adopt a similar kind of resolution in Serbian national parliament. This kind of desired outcome, these kind of changes that the EU wants to see in candidate countries, and if we talk about this concrete example, these kind of changes, they have been taken to be some kind of markers of positive change, because if you look at the progress reports then used to evaluate the progress of said country into the EU accession process, you will see that the EU clearly sees this kind of changes, the vibes, let's say, not even big changes, but any kind of like changes in national memory politics as symbol of some kind of positive change that can be rewarded by the EU, because it is seen as an example of reconciliation, fostering good neighborly relations with other countries, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the examples that is quite clear, because there is this intent, and if Serbia is dealing with the crimes, and this is going to show us and show everybody that Serbia wants seriously to engage with these issues that are there have been really serious problems in relations with the neighbors. But there are other instances and there are other cases where Europeanization of memory is just a tool to achieve something else. And here I want to bring another example, which is, I think, less famous, because about Serbia being pressured about Srebrenica. I think that everybody knows that. Another example actually concerns, again, Serbia, but also Hungary, and dealing with the crimes that the partisans, the communist military forces in the Second World War, committed in a number of villages in Vojvodina, which is northern Serbia. So there was a certain point in the EU accession process of Serbia when Serbia realized that needed support for start of negotiations and wanted to secure support from Hungary. So what actually happened is that Serbia overnight called the parliament, literally during the night, its own national Serbian parliament, and proposed a text that will condemn a number of communist crimes that happened in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the parliament adopted this resolution overnight. And the discussion that they had in the Serbian parliament was quite interesting, because how do you motivate adopting that kind of resolution in such a short time without actually engaging historians or historical commissions, or actually doing some sort of research and like trying to let's say correct injustices in a real sense of that word. So the framing of the need to have such a resolution was quite interesting, because it said like Serbia needs to do that because we want to have the support from Hungarians, and this is something that Hungarians want. They want to have this kind of resolution adopted by the Serbian parliament. So it was a clear, having this kind of resolution, it had nothing to do with European values. It had nothing to do with endorsing those, European values or principles of peace, reconciliation, or dealing with the past. It certainly did have nothing to do with providing acknowledgement for the victims. It was a simple political trade-off between Serbia and Hungary. And it was a win-win situation, because the nationalists in Hungary, they were really happy to have such a resolution. And the political elites in Serbia, they secured the date for the start of the EU negotiations. So what this case actually shows, and I hope that I explain it, like I'm talking really fast, I'm sorry for that. What this case actually shows is that memory can be used to clearly obtain political advantages in the process of Europeanization. So when we talk about Europeanization of memory, we do not necessarily think about correcting injustices, having this kind of new approach towards the victims, acknowledging the victims, providing some kind of retribution or restitution for the victims. We can also see how the Europeanist memory framework is actually being manipulated by the political elites. And there is also another dimension to the downloading of the European memory politics, especially in the Western Balkans. And this dimension is that downloading of certain contents selectively from, let me rephrase that. So candidate countries, they decide by themselves what kind of contents for the EU memory framework they want to adopt in their own national parliaments, and what kind of narratives and interpretations of the past best fit their own particular national interests. So in the case of totalitarian interpretation of the past, this was quite useful, as I said, for a number of countries, for a number of political elites, for a number of political parties. And what actually happened if we confront Serbia and Croatia in their own respective roles and views and narratives about the Second World War? What actually happened is that in the pre-accession, for instance, in Croatia, we have seen a number of resolutions, a number of commemorations being organized that actually, on the one hand, try to reinterpret the history of the Second World War. There was this kind of increase of interest, sudden increase of interest for the commemoration of the Holocaust, which is happening now respectively in Serbia. And this kind of reinterpretation of the Holocaust has actually faded after the country joined the European Union. What actually also happened is that this kind of anti-totalitarian interpretation of the Yugoslav past, especially in Slovenia, I think, and in Croatia, has brought to the forefront also a new dimension to the ways that the history of the Second World War is seen. So we have seen the emergence of narratives of victims of communism and equalization of Yugoslav communism with the communist regimes that existed in other countries. Because let us not forget that when the European Parliament, when the European Union made this resolution on the equalization, let's say, of communist and fascist and Nazi crimes, they had in mind the experiences of the countries that were once behind the Iron Curtain. And as most of you know, that was not the case with Yugoslavia, but I'm sure some people would probably have a comment on that. What happened in Serbia with the interpretation of the anti-totalitarian paradigm was that a number of political parties have endorsed this EU memory framework and this particular interpretation of the past, and they use it to revive and reinterpret the experiences of the ultra-nationalist movement of the Second World War, Chetniks, as most of you know. And they actually, there is a really interesting chapter in our edited volume on it. They actually claimed and sort of claim even today that these ultra-nationalists were the first anti-totalitarians in the region. So this is really briefly on what the downloading actually is and how the countries selectively can take the contents from the EU memory framework and adopt it in their national parliaments, and how these contents of the EU memory framework can be co-opted, manipulated by a really wide variety of actors. So on the other hand, we have also uploading, because as I said, how this EU memory framework is made, who made it and how they made it and for what purposes. This is also quite important because as I said, the timing and the status that a country has in the as being a member of the European Union has a lot of importance. So what I mean by this, I mean that in the pre-accession, countries selectively and tactfully download the contents of the EU memory framework to demonstrate their place in European family, but also to pursue this kind of symbolic and political objectives. So these kind of power asymmetries, they have played a really important role in making interventions in national memory politics. But what happens when the country joins the EU? So it happens that actually the roles are reversed, and the countries, now member states, they project their own domestic national memory politics onto the EU transnational level. So what they do, they upload domestic discourses, domestic views, that historical DNA we talked about at the beginning, they project it on the transnational level, and they seek endorsement and recognition of those national views of the past by their peers, by other member states. So if once they were just the passive receivers of EU memory politics, as new members, they use this kind of power symmetry to pursue, let's say, a pragmatic foreign policy towards non-members, and in most of the cases, it's their neighbors. And because these other countries are in a way directly or indirectly threatening their own views of the past. So what this actually suggests is that, you know, if we once, before this Europeanization of memory, if we once had this kind of, you know, memory wars and bilateral disputes, et cetera, these are only escalated now even more, you know, like they're going transnationally now. So if we had a memory war between two countries on a certain topic, now we have European memory wars. So this means that the European Union, in this case in particular, it serves as a memory arena, but it also serves as a political opportunity structure, you know, for the uploading of these domestic preferences, which are actually the national narratives about the past. Why is this important for the Western Balkans? And why it's becoming really, really visible only with the EU integration going Western Balkans, is that these power asymmetries, they play now a more important role than had in the past. For instance, when the Baltics joined the European Union, there was more or less between the Baltic countries consensus on, you know, what the past was and who were the victims, who were the perpetrators, what kind of crimes were committed, et cetera, et cetera. There was this kind of similar kind of interpretation. With the Western Balkans, we do not have that, because every country has its own view of what happened in the Second World War, what happened in the 1990s war, et cetera, et cetera. And they're really, they really have this kind of national monopoly over the past. So what we have seen with all this transitional justice work, with the Europeanization process, et cetera, over the last 30 years in the Western Balkans, since the war started, is that there is no regional consensus on what the past is, and what was the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and what were the other historical episodes. And why is that? Because, as I said in the very beginning, you know, memory politics is malleable, and it's also a dimension of power. So it means that every country has the right, and it uses that right, to pursue its all domestic memory politics that suits its nation and state building agendas, also other political objectives such as joining the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. Why the power symmetries are again quite important in the case of the Western Balkans is that we have countries in the Western Balkans that are in different kind of stages of the integration process. We have countries that are still relatively far from the accession, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina or Kosovo, and some are in the midst of this process, and some of them have joined the European Union, such as Croatia and Slovenia. And this kind of position, I'm checking the time, Florian, and this kind of position of the country in the accession process really, really importantly affects the nature of the Europeanization and memory politics interplay. So what this actually means, the first country that joined the European Union, Slovenia, Slovenia played a crucial role in establishing, solidifying this narrative of anti-totalitarianism at the EU level. I will not go into depth. If you want more information on that, I can tell you in the Q&A session. But I will just say that during the presidency in 2008, Slovenia actually initiated this transnational process of examining crimes that were committed by totalitarian regimes in Europe. They made a number of hearings, but also they brought this kind of interpretation of Yugoslav political regime as totalitarian. Croatia, the second country, Western Balkan country to become the EU member, equally endorsed this kind of views at the EU level. Most notably, I think in the European Parliament, they even called for the establishment of this special DG for dealing with the crimes. If I'm not mistaken, that was at the time when Andrej Plenković was the member of the European Parliament with the European People's Party, and they were really, really interested, let's say, and really supportive of having that kind of DG at the European level. I'll actually having Croatia to lead that process at the European level. So as I said, these kind of countries like Slovenia and Croatia, because they were first to join the European Union, they were in this kind of a privileged, gatekeeping position to actually upload their own domestic preferences and their own views of the past. So I think this is quite important, because it actually goes to show that the pace of the EU integration process actually has a major effect on the Western Balkans, because the countries that will join the European Union in the future, they will not be in, they will be in really, I think, particular kind of position when it comes to uploading their own domestic preferences and views of the past. So really briefly, maybe another 5 more minutes to discuss the effects of Europeanization of memory in the Western Balkans more concretely, and then I will finish there. I just want to say that, like in the edited volume that we made, we tried to examine every country in the Western Balkans and see what are these kind of dominant issues, let's say memory issues or memory conflicts that exist there, and to see in what kind of ways these were affected or are affected by the Europeanization of memory. We wanted actually to see whether there are some traces, like of the positive effects of Europeanization of memory in the region. And when we look at those, we tend to reach the agreement that, like the intended effect with the Europeanization of memory actually is a positive one. So if we see what kind of Europeanization of memory, what actually Europeanization of memory would entail, what kind of positive effects it could produce, maybe we can think about producing some sort of reconciliation reconciling divergent views in the past, finding a common ground, providing acknowledgement for the victims, all the tenets of this kind of transitional justice approach. So having a multifocal approach to memory, multifocal approach to history, seeing one object from a number of different angles is actually, essentially a positive idea. But inclusive memory politics, that is really mindful of others' past, others' victimhood and suffering, it's quite difficult to achieve at the European level, but it's also difficult to achieve in the Western Balkans. So to Europeanize memory would actually mean that, it would be actually perceived by a number of people as an attempt to pacify some kind of tensions that exist, that, to provide acknowledgement, to make amends, I think, also for the past, and to deal with the past, to bridge the differences, and to have this kind of multi-perspectivity. But if we look at, how these kind of, ideas were translated in the Western Balkans, then then we hit actually the wall. Because if we think about, reconciliation as something that was really much needed, that is still much needed in the post-conflict regions, and we confront this, with what were the actions of the European Union after the conflict in the Western Balkans, we can think about, responding this kind of Franco-German model of reconciliation to the Western Balkans. And let me maybe explain this a bit more. So the European Union, as I said at the very beginning, has this kind of reconciliation ideal in its core, and it's quite represented also in its memory politics. And the European Union also in the Western Balkans tried to use this copy-paste model based on its own historical experiences and its own memory to the region. So a number of initiatives that actually were supported by the European Union in fostering reconciliation in the region actually were emulating what has been seen in the Franco-German case. So we had these kind of joint historical books that were made. The problem with those books was that it had this kind of, they have this kind of multifocal approach to history, but the problem again is implementation, because history teachers, they are not obliged to use this kind of textbooks, but they can, some instances, opt to use them or not to use them. There was a number of European Union's, let's say, support for joint commemorations, organizing joint commemorations, making apologies for the past crimes and past injustices, etc., etc. So all these kind of, events that were going on over the last 30 years were used as some sort of markers of let's say, positive effects that Europeanization has on dealing with the past in the region. But still, we did not arrive to the point where we actually have this kind of shared and common understanding of the past. What is also quite tricky, as I would say, like as more of an unintended consequence of Europeanization of memory in the region, is that we have seen this kind of initiatives that are actually going against this main idea that exists behind the construction of the EU memory framework. So, as I mentioned, like we had the enacting of the Holocaust canons of remembrance. That is something that actually happens quite strongly in the pre-accession period, and complete abandonment of those, previously endorsed EU canons of remembrance after the country joins the European Union. So to maybe bring another example is that every year at the site of Jasenovac in Croatia, the Croatian presidents would come, they will kneel, they will attend the commemoration. And what is happening now after the country joined the European Union is that there is no actually anymore this kind of, high level presence or very much interest actually on that date. And this was also perceived by the associations of the victims or the descendants from different kind of minorities, especially the Jewish, Serbian, and Roma one in Croatia, that for a number of years have boycotted this commemoration and call it a memory circus. Because commemorations have become actually a display, a very public display to put forward some of the, the ideas that are serving political objectives at that particular moment. So until the country joins the European Union, they play it safe and they endorse the EU norms of remembrance, so-called European values, etc., etc. And what happens next is this return to the previously enacted memory politics, the one of, in Croatian case, I would say of nationalism. And this was quite visible also in a number of different cases that I don't have the time to discuss now, but if you want, you can look at in the book, especially in confronting the experiences of the war veterans in Croatia and their own views of the past with the how to say, the rights of sexual minorities. Another example, maybe that is quite interesting, is the one of Mostar, and there is a really nice chapter in our book on this topic, is the ways in which local actors also can be complicit in endorsing the European norms of remembrance for certain political objectives. Another case that is quite, I think, telling is that, in some instances, victims associations and survivors themselves, they want to emulate EU forms of remembrance because they think that in that way, on transnational level and, internationally, other institutions, other kind of associations would be able to recognize and better understand what are the problems that they are facing. So I'm thinking about the Omarska camp and privatization of that particular site of suffering and the ways that survivors groups actually are using these EU forms of remembrance to actually fight against the politics of forgetting that the national political elites pursue. So I think I will stop here because we can discuss a number of cases, I think, but the essence is there. I think on what the Europeanization of memory politics actually entails in the Western Balkans and what are its positive effects, so-called positive effects, and also unintended consequences. So Florian, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna, for this really kind of excellent overview and bringing up these topics. So I think that provides for a good framework for discussion.